Hi everyone, welcome to your first content module, and we are reviewing chapter 1 of the Ivy textbook. We're looking at intentional interviewing, and as I mentioned in I think my welcome video, we're really going to be focusing very hard as we start out this semester on those foundational skills that every counselor has to develop in order to be an effective and ethical counselor when you're doing your work. So starting at the basics and at the beginning with interviewing. You will not be able to become a successful therapist or counselor unless you have good interviewing skills. It's just not possible. And it's quite normal for anybody coming in as a new counselor during your practicum, especially a little bit during your internship, to be starting out doing intake interviews. And so that's why I put a lot of focus on that, on interviewing in general. And that's why I like this textbook, because interviewing is the very first thing often that happens when a client it comes to a counseling agency or a service or whatever it might be. The first thing that's happening for that client typically is an interview. For anybody that's received counseling themselves, you're probably familiar with this, right? You're not just going in and sitting down with a counselor and right off the bat starting into, the real deep emotional issues. You are providing you're providing your educational history. You're providing them with the basics, with the demographics that you identify with your psychosocial history, all of those things, your family history, your medical history. There's so much that goes into the interviewing process, and those interviews are what helps counselors determine would that client be a good fit with them, right? Because sometimes people are good fits and sometimes they aren't. And I'm not talking about referring somebody because of belief system, and we'll get into that. But sometimes, again, if you've ever been to a counseling session that's bad, or you've ever been to a counselor who you just didn't feel a connection with, or in our situation as counselors, if we are looking at what a client is expressing as a need or a goal during that interview process, and it's not something that we are trained in, if it's not something that we are competent in, if it's a service that we cannot provide for that individual, then we're able to determine that based off of usually a lot of that general information that's garnished during those intake interviews. So really, it's just a matter of gathering data, listening to the client, and sometimes these intake interviews take a bit of time. They might take longer than a typical counseling session. And so it's important to know that there are I don't want to say the intake interview can make or break everything, but if a client has a bad experience during their intake interview, if a counselor or if an intake specialist or an intern or whoever it might be is just sitting there typing away on a computer and not making eye contact, not listening, not responding or attending to that potential client, it really could be the difference between that client coming back for their first actual counseling session and deciding, this isn't for me. So again, you can think about the times that you've had good interviews, bad interviews, what happens during the bad interviews, takeaways from talking with other people and doing that initial intake if you've been in that seat before. So moving on to the next kind of major term, and you're going to hear all of these terms throughout the remainder of the semester. Counseling, of course, being one of the most major terms you're going to hear throughout the program, obviously, but it's an intensive process. It starts with that interview again, but then it goes deeper. It's an evidence-based practice, and you're going to hear that term a lot in our program because when you work with a counselor, or when you, in your internship, in your practicum, for instance, the counselors that you're working with are guided by theory, and they're guided by specific skills and techniques that have been studied, have been researched, and have been proven to be effective for working with specific clientele or specific populations. It is not just that somebody is coming in and sitting and talking without having a goal, without having a plan, without having a roadmap. When you think of theory and you think of techniques, really look at it as a roadmap. I think back to the days of paper maps, which will age me a little bit, and being required by my father to highlight the route that we were going to be going on when we took vacations as a child on our paper copy roadmap, and then getting in trouble for not folding it right. But you could, if you veer off a little bit on that roadmap, your theoretical roadmap, your technique roadmap, there can be times where you just get lost out there, and it becomes a disaster of a trip. But other times you can just kind of take a little detour and get right back on that roadmap. So counseling is essentially that. And those theories, the skills and techniques, those are the things you're going to be learning in this 501 class and next in the fall semester whenever you take 606. There's also a bit of art to it, because as much as we can read about theory, as much as we are learning about techniques specifically and getting those foundational skills ingrained throughout this semester, becoming comfortable sitting in that counselor seat, so to say, as much as we can read about things, it doesn't prepare us for that human-to-human interaction. We cannot predict what another human being is going to say, what their response will be. No matter how hard we try, we just aren't there yet. So the art of it comes with that unknown when you're in session with somebody, that you can provide information, you can ask questions in the right way, but you just can't predict what your client's going to say back, and you can't predict what the response will be. And so that's why one of the biggest things that we focus on this semester is attending to your client and listening, active listening, which is different than just general listening. And we'll get more into that later on. Now, psychotherapy, moving on to, I don't know what slide I'm on here, slide 4, if you're following along with slides. Psychotherapy is a very common term, but in the profession of counseling, historically, psychiatrists conduct psychotherapy. And, this is more of that traditional, what we might think of as somebody laying on a couch and a psychotherapist analyzing every little thing, dreams, behaviors, past experiences, relationships with mothers and fathers, that kind of thing. You think Freud when you think of psychotherapy. There is a movement towards having other professionals like licensed counselors, getting additional training so that they're able to provide psychotherapy. Psychotherapy tends to be more long-term. With each counseling theory that's out there, generally speaking, you're looking at a different number of sessions that a client might be seeking if they're coming to you. So if you are doing solution-focused therapy, I identify as a solution-focused counselor, very short term, maybe 5 to 8 sessions total. In the world of solution-focused therapy, we believe that work is being done before anybody even does the intake interviews. So it's a little bit different. Cognitive behavioral therapy, around 8 to 15 sessions, I would say. Motivational interviewing is like 16 to 17. So you're looking at when you're looking at different theoretical orientations, there's kind of and again, it varies client by client, obviously, and based on their need. But by and large, the rest of the orientations to counseling are relatively short. When you're looking at psychotherapy, it may not be practical in all situations because of the duration of time that it typically will take. Individuals that practice psychotherapy typically, are looking at working with their clients for a year and beyond. So those are the 3 major terms that we're going to be focusing on, again, essentially throughout the semester. But, you're going to hear a lot about in these first couple of chapters, interviewing and skills that are needed to effectively interview a client. And then we'll move into the counseling realm, okay? Statistics, stats are fun, right? Always. 21% of clients don't return after the first session. About 50% finish up in about 4 sessions. And really, dropout rates tend to be high among young clients and minorities. Lots of different reasons that factor into all of this. For one, for individuals not returning after the first session, I think one thing that our profession is doing now is asking and providing follow-up surveys and satisfaction surveys to clients to try to gain a better idea of why somebody may not have come back. Whether it be that they just didn't feel like it was needed again, or they felt like that one session was fantastic and phenomenal and they didn't need anything else, or maybe there were other issues. With the 50% statistic of people finishing in 4 sessions, again, dependent on the type of theoretical orientation you might be using to practice and the techniques, you're really, you're not there to be a crutch for the client. We're there to listen to what their goals are and help them achieve their goals, and then help them to maintain, that quality of life throughout. Not that people can't come back to see us, but every client that I had, when I left them, I felt, mostly, it's 80%, felt like they were, able to advocate for themselves. They were able to make decisions. They were able to use some of the skills that we had worked on in those counseling sessions. And so, it may not take a lot of time. Dropout rates among younger clients and minorities, really a lot of that has to do with competence. And there's been tons of different studies, especially on, the identity of the counselor versus the identity of the client. And, really historically, counseling services have been, conducted by white males, middle class. We're seeing a little bit of shift in terms of females, but it's still largely Caucasian individuals. So that majorly plays into why individuals may not return. So is it all worth it? Absolutely. Counseling is considered a soft science, so we don't always get the cred that I think we should get. And we don't have as much of a long-standing research base, because we are a relatively new profession in the grand scheme of the other professions that are like counseling. So we are now, I think, doing a better job of this in counseling. I'm sorry, my dog walks around and she's got long nails and it's pretty annoying, but that's, if you're hearing some clicking in the background, that's what it is. But I think the counseling profession is doing a fantastic job now with really focusing on the use of evidence-based practice, expanding our research base, expanding our understanding of the connection between the brain and the body and the mind, how everything works, looking at neuroscience, looking at culture, things that we didn't know about in the past that we're learning more about now, and things that we quite frankly ignored in the past, like differences in identities and how that impacts the relationship between a counselor and a client, and working to develop our own competence in certain areas. So effective counseling, what do you think of when you think of effective counseling and what it might include? Well, of course, there's a client. Needs to be a client, and you as the therapist and counselor, but there's a relationship that happens there as well. The relationship is between you and that individual, and others, quite honestly. It's between your understanding of what their life is like, your own personal worldview, and how that impacts the relationship. Of course, there's treatment. There might be different modalities that you're using. There might be other individuals involved in the treatment planning for the client. Feedback in terms of the client giving you feedback. We don't always think about that in the counseling session, but it's good and necessary to ask clients throughout their duration with you, am I doing what you expect? Is this helping? If not, let's talk about it. So you really have to, and I think this program does a good job of this, you have to be receptive and open to that feedback from the client. All right, the importance of language. You will hear from me all the time about using person-first language, and I will be very strict about it because it is very meaningful to us. So if you are not familiar with what person-first language means, I've got a little bit of a tool for you from the Department of Labor that talks about what person-first language means. So really we're looking at, when we're just using any kind of descriptive statement about an individual, we're using an individual first, we're putting them first, and then putting the mental health impairment, the diagnosis, whatever it might be, after. So an individual with a disability, an individual who uses a wheelchair, an individual with anxiety disorder, disorder, an individual who's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. We do not use problem-oriented language. One of the biggest issues is that we need to be focusing on or switching how we write and think about how we describe individuals with mental health impairments and who are seeking counseling services. Oftentimes, we're not focusing on strengths, we're focusing on weaknesses. One of the biggest offenders of that is when we use terms like suffering or afflicted with. So if you write any kind of paper for me and you say, an individual who is suffering with anxiety and depression, I'm going to cross out suffering and put diagnosed, because there's a million other ways to describe somebody who has been diagnosed with depression and anxiety, rather than attributing, that strong feeling of suffering with that. Okay. So we are focusing on strengths, we are focusing on abilities, and we are using that person first language from here until the end of time, please. So one thing that this Ivy textbook does is provide this lovely little skills pyramid for us. And we are really starting out again down at the bottom here at the beginning of the semester. We're going to be talking about ethics, multicultural competence, attending and empathy skills first. So these are all those micro skills, and you'll hear that term a lot too, because that's what these are, micro skills. They're effective communication skills that all counselors should possess and have to continue working on in order to provide counseling versus talk therapy. It's harmful to our clients and really to our profession if it's not done correctly. And practice is key. Now, it is unethical to be providing counseling to your relatives, to your significant others, to your kids, to your parents, but not a but, I shouldn't say but. That negates what I just said. So it is unethical to be doing that. In this class, when you're learning about these specific micro skills, you can use those in general conversations with anybody else around you. You can practice listening, active listening. You can practice attending. You can practice asking questions that are open-ended. You can practice these things without providing counseling to an individual, and I encourage you to do so because practice is key for development of these skills. There's also a nice little chart that Ivy provides on different micro skills and how each theory, and it's a short list of theories, I will say that, it's not all the theories that are out there, but how much each skill is used depending on the theory that somebody might be adhering to. So I think that's a really useful chart to be looking at as well. I'll refer to it throughout the semester. And finally, the setting. If we're thinking about interviewing and eventually counseling, where can it occur? I mean, honestly, anywhere. I think that there's been an expansion in our understanding of where counseling can occur thanks to COVID. Pre-COVID, there were, really providing distance counseling, telemental health was really not something that was widely accepted. We see that now a lot. Quite frankly, we see more, I would say, more of that, or at least the option, than I have ever seen before. And because of that, there are ethical things that need to be considered. We need to be understanding of the technology that's being used, limitations, and safety checks, how to verify that somebody is who they say they are if you're doing telemental health counseling. But really, interviewing and counseling can occur anywhere. There's even certifications and training programs for individuals that want to do like wilderness counseling or nature-based counseling. So you're out in nature providing counseling. So it can happen. It can occur anywhere, any time of the day. In terms of physical decor, I always stress that anybody that needs to be accessing a counselor should be able to access a counselor, and we see a lot of discrepancies in terms of individuals with disabilities, especially those with physical disabilities, feeling like they can access counselors, whether it be because of the physical location or inaccessible locations, or not or counselors saying they're not able to get things like an interpreter or provide alternative format. So those are just things that, again, this is not the last time you're going to be hearing from me about those things, but just things to be mindful of in general in terms of making sure that whenever you get to the point where you are out there in the real world counseling, that your services are being offered and accessible to anybody that wants to seek counseling. So I like to keep these relatively short, around 20 minutes. That's my typical cutoff time. So I'm going to leave you all with the discussion boards this week. I'll get in as I can. There's also a sample intake form that you should be looking at just to see what all might be involved in an intake. Hang on to it. It'll probably be useful whenever you get to the role plays. And I hope everybody has a lovely week. If you're in the Northeast and you're getting snow, I hope everybody stays safe, and I hope everybody is well.